So last time we talked, I made a mess. What I've done is gone back a little bit, and you notice the gloves, I smoothed them out a little bit. Just one more layer lightly over the top really can smooth out areas. The other thing is that you'll notice a few of these areas, you see some pencil marks. I've actually gone back and drawn in some of the lines that were there originally just so I could see them better. No rules here, okay? So we are working with water. So this is going to be good for bringing in, and again, always test it out a little bit. You know, I can test it here. Definitely looks like when I paint it on here, it looks like a shadow of that green. So that's what we're looking for. And then in the still life, I'll be looking at some of those areas underneath the glove that I'll start to paint in. So I'm just going to kind of lightly add in a little bit of this contrast so I can start to see some of the details come out. And again, you know, work minimally to begin with. You can always make things go darker. Sometimes it's harder to get things back to light, but I'll also talk about that a little bit today too. Okay, so I'm just looking for areas where I could definitely see some contrast from the glove onto the green of the backdrop. And I'm just going to layer in some of that paint. So I'll do this fast motion so you can see. Okay, so that's a little bit of a start. So you'll notice that the last step there, I added some water first and then dropped the green into it because that shadow underneath the shell is a little bit blurry. So, you know, it's still a little bit loose. I just want to get some contrast in here. The next thing I'm going to do, what I did was I mixed up some of that Prussian blue here. Okay, I mixed that into here. I added a little bit, I'm sorry, the cobalt blue, and then the Prussian blue I added into here. And then I used just a little bit of black. Now, I recommend, if you're going to use black, always add it into a color, right? Sometimes black has too much contrast against other sort of objects. So here what I'm going to do is just look for the shadows that are casting from the shell onto the glove that are definitely the darkest. I'm just going to put in a little bit of that line work. And then I've got a little bit lighter blue mixed up, a little bit lighter blue here that I mixed up, and I'll do that into some of the shadow work. So I'm just going to take this really dark blue and speed up a bit so you can see, but I'm just going to bring in some of the Okay, so now I've got that darkness in. I'm going to go and I took the Prussian blue and I've added this in here. Sorry, I keep saying the wrong blue. Cobalt blue. And then down here, I've got some sienna. It's a little bit of a complement. It's an orangey brown. I'm going to add this into it. So again, it's going to darken it a bit. And that's going to give me a color that I feel like is going to be pretty good into some of those areas where it's shadowed on the glove. So we'll mix this here so we can see, maybe lighten it up just a little bit. Something like that looks pretty good. Maybe just a touch of white so it's not super contrasty, but just has a little bit of that pop. All right, that looks pretty good. So here what I'm going to do is I actually drew in some of the areas where I saw some of the folds and where there's definitely some shadows hidden. So I'm just going to go and paint those in. Okay, so you can see I've got some more values in the glove now, and it's really starting to become more three-dimensional. So in doing this process, you're kind of moving a bit from, you know, painting large swatches, kind of like painting the fence, right? Where you're just trying to cover area. In this case, you really have to think about the direction of the mark and how it can become linear, right? So you'll see that I added a lot of these areas that are filling in shapes, but they're also changing direction. They're becoming more linear, and they're adding more three-dimensionality to the composition. So this process of going in for step 3 is going to be adding contrast. Where can you start to look for light and shadow that is definitely going to help show the differences between subtle areas of each object? Where is it darker? Where is it lighter? And then also reinforcing some of the colors as you go through. So what I would do to continue this, I could totally just work into the glove and finish it, which I'm tempted to do sometimes. But I'm actually going to kind of, this level of detail so far, which is not there yet, it's, you know, halfway there, I'm going to bring to the other objects. So I'm going to add some contrast in the shell. I'm going to add some contrast in the vessel here, and then we can take a look again and I can point out what I've done. Okay, so I jumped forward a bit. I wanted to just point out a few things. So I mixed up some pretty dark red. What I did was I used the crimson here, okay, and then I added a little bit of black to it, and that just tones it down enough to make this very, very dark color for the inside of the liquid. And then you can see that I'm very carefully painted it in to really increase the contrast. We can clearly see the shell against this now very strongly. Also added some line work down below with some of the dark green, okay, in the vessel here, and then also some of the dark violet that I mixed up. And one thing you can notice about this, and I do want you guys to really remember that what we're doing is we're observing and we're noticing, and what we notice we got to try to put into action, okay? So I noticed that the light areas are starting to become a lot brighter because I've added the contrast of the darker color, right? So our eye is going to like read the whole composition. It's going to read the range from light to dark. And your areas that are light are going to look lighter if the dark areas are darker, right? So we have to add that contrast to sort of pull out form, right? It helps to increase the way that we understand the shape. But then it also does something like this, where this suddenly starts to take on a whole lot more brightness. Same with the reflections that I've added into some of these things. So I may have to tone them down a little bit more compared to my still life, but it's a really good start to add some depth to this. So the last thing I'll do is add a bit more contrast to the shell, and that'll pretty much finish out step 3. The consecutive steps are going to be refining, 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 right? So imagine carving a block of ice into a sculpture. First, you're going to just knock away big pieces that you don't need anymore. Next, you're going to go in and kind of like, you know, shape and refine to the general form. That's what we've done with the glove. We've got the general form of the glove. And then it comes into the details, you know. If you think about like refining the edges and the textures and things like that, that's where we'll really allow this to look, really have a lot of depth and realism to it. So I'm going to kind of go over step 4 and 5 in next videos, but I'm going to finish this up. I added some contrast to the shell so you can see where that's gone from start to finish, and we'll do a little side-by-side comparison. Okay, well, I added a bit more contrast to the shell. So you can see that down below here, I've added a bit more darker tones, also up near the top and also in the interior of the shell. So a couple of different things I did. Essentially what I needed down here was a shadow color from the shell. And the shell is made up of a bunch of different kind of sienna orangey colors and blue colors. So basically that's what I did. I just grabbed some of the cobalt and some of the sienna and mixed those up, and you end up getting this kind of nice gray color if you balance out the two values kind of back and forth. And this was a good color for me to use to bring in. Now I watered it down quite a bit, and that will help too, just to, you know, give an even kind of wash. So what I'm doing is just kind of giving a wash of the color in those areas. And then also I kind of went back and dropped in a little bit dots of like sienna just to kind of like increase the texture a little bit, because I don't want that texture to go away that I generated. So I worked back and forth there. Then in the interior, I used a little bit of the crimson, a little bit of the black, and also a little bit of the sienna to kind of make this muted, grayed out interior. So the interior of the shell has a little bit of that violet and kind of umbery kind of color coming through. So that's what I've done there. And this kind of completes the third step, which is try to add contrast. So from the before and after, you can see that blocked in the colors in the second step. And in the third step, what I'm really working on here is, you know, just trying to give some form, add contrast to look at some of the shadows. And again, we're moving from kind of painting the walls and painting the fence, trying to get those big swatches of color in, to areas that are more subtle and controlling the marks and thinking about them in a linear fashion. So that's it for step 3. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to point out was, I've been overlaying an image, a photograph that I took, the still life, and you can tell in the photograph it's a little bit different than the still life painting that I'm working on because I am working from observation. So I'm using this. I'm sitting in the same seat at the same height to look closely at the still life, and it is hard to photograph exactly the same as your eyes see. Cameras and our eyes are set up a little bit differently. So what I'm gonna do is go into some details. Let's zoom in. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to point out was a technique that I use a lot, which is really great with watercolor, and it's actually more of an erasing technique. So what I noticed in here is that the shell is being reflected into the bottle as well as the glove. And so what I'm going to do is kind of take away some of this and add in layers of a little bit of this orangey kind of sienna color and then a bit of the blue into the bottle so it looks like it's reflective. I've already started a little bit here, you can see. And basically the technique is to take a wet brush, okay, kind of saturate the area a little bit, and you kind of have to, polish it a little bit, kind of work the brush back and forth in order for the paint to be reactivated and actually, lift from the surface. Now I will add that you can't do this too many times before you hit the pulp of the paper. If you notice the paper starting to lift, then you should probably stop. So once it's saturated like that, you've got a little bit of time before you can take a paper towel and simply blot it. And notice how much of the paint has come up. So that gives me a great opportunity then to take a little bit of color and add a translucent layer. So I've got this sienna that I'm mixing up, right, with a little bit of blue so that I can, and I'm watering it down, and I'm just going to paint in a little bit of that to give it that quality of the shell. So reflections are interesting because you can see both the object that's reflected, plus you can see through it. So we need to kind of convey that effectively as we're working into it. All right, so I'll add that into it, which looks pretty good. The reflection does get darker closer to the shell when I'm looking at the still life, so I'm just going to leave that as is. Next, I'm just going to go in, and I can see the glove kind of wrapping around in this area here, so I'm going to lift up some of this color in through here, and that will be a bit of the reflection of the glove that I'll add in. So again, you need to kind of like keep it saturated, keep it wet, not dripping so it's going to go all over the place, but just enough that you can pick it up a little bit. All right. So this is a good technique. A lot of people want to go over and add white over the top of things for highlights, which you can try to do. But white, even though the white is a little more opaque than the other colors, it's not going to completely cover. So this technique allows you to kind of like lift up some of the tone, and also it softens too, right? Like it's kind of like when we were erasing in the graphite drawing, it makes a softer mark, right, for clouds and sky and water and stuff like that. This is the same thing. All right, got that lifted up, and then I'm going to mix up. I already have some of the glove color, which is the cobalt blue, a little bit of white, and I'm going to choose a little bit smaller brush and get that paint activated, and then I can add in some of that color there, right? So again, color is not static. It bounces around, bounces off of objects, it gets reflected into objects, and we need to be able to show that in the work that we're doing. Again, noticing is the important part. Another area I'm going to use this technique is I see a little bit of reflection on the left side of the bottle, kind of a long striation. So I'm going to take and make a long striation through here like this. I'm going to do this really quickly because I don't want the violet to blend too much into the background. I'm already striking this a little bit. That's all right. Blot this up pretty quickly and actually go back and try to get some of that to come out a little bit more. So again, what I just want to point out is that watercolor, while it can definitely stain your clothes and stuff like that, it's not super permanent on the surface, which is great for these types of techniques where we can apply some more details to, right? So that's looking pretty good compared to what I'm noticing, and I'm going to add in a little bit of green to this because I'm getting that kind of reflection happening. Right. So that's a great way to, start to think about adding highlights and details into areas. I'm going to go into another technique in just a minute. Let me just pause it for a sec. I'll come right back. Okay, so the next area that I'm going to focus on is this, the neck and the lid of this bottle. And what I'm noticing at the bottle is there's a lot of these thin line striations that run through it. And I want to capture those. This is a different technique, which is called a dry brush technique. So what I want to do here is just get this into view. I want to take my flat brush and I want to dry it off with a paper towel and kind of spread out the bristles like this. All right. So I have a dry brush, and then I have another brush here with some paint. Let's get this into focus. Working on small. Let's zoom out a little bit. All right. So then I've got this paint that I'm mixing up, and it's already dry, which is good. And I want to add just a little bit of water in here because I don't want it to be too wet. All right. And what I'll do is with this, kind of thin, but rather, a little bit darker color. Add a little tiny bit of green into here too. Okay, that's pretty good. So I'll take this dry brush, right? And you need to have a piece of paper to test this out on to really make it effective. But you just kind of like grab some of that color, okay? Kind of spread out the bristles a little bit, and then you can see that I'm getting multiple marks, and I'm going to make it darker for you to be able to see. Let's do it with this violet here. There we go. So you see how I'm getting lots of little lines? That can be really effective when you're working with different tones as well. So, but you want to keep the paint relatively dry. So I'm going into these areas where it's been like dried and kind of like, again, separating the bristles a little bit and then using that technique. So that when I come in here, I'm going to go around the neck of the bottle just lightly to get some of those striations to come in. And a little bit more liquid to make this work. There we go. All right, so I'm getting a little bit of that kind of multiple linear textures that I'm looking for, and making it a bit more effective in that way. So dry brush technique, you can, if you do it well, you should mix up a dark color, right? And let's just darken this a bit. There we go. Separate out your brush so it has multiple lines, and then you can use it to paint, very textural kind of linear marks, right? So that can be really helpful when you're starting to work into this part of the project. All right, so that's pretty good. Got some details going there. Dry brush technique is good for a variety of things. Again, you make the paint dark and make your brush dry, and you can add sort of scratchy texture marks over the surface. All right, so I'm going to be adding some details to this lid and back a little bit. You can see that I've added a bit more tone and contrast into these areas. Notice how these white reflections look much brighter now that I've added a darker background around them. So remember that you're really going to make things look lighter by increasing contrast, right? So what I'm doing here is I'm taking a little bit of black, all right, and some of the green, and some of the crimson to make a pretty dark color, all right? And now this, what I'm going to do is when I'm adding paint to the brush, I'm also going to roll it a little bit, and that's going to make for a really nice point, right? And then I can go in here and do some linear elements. And this is going to take a little bit of practice, but what you want to do is just slowly add the paint to get those darker tones to come. Brush down really hard, you're going to get a wide mark. If you very lightly touch, you can get a thin mark. And it's just a matter of practicing between those type of mark making. So I'm just looking for where I can add contrast to this. And if it looks too dark to begin with, it's probably okay because you might need to just add more tones around it. So I'm looking for any of those darker areas where I can start to add, again, some more contrast and detail into it. Okay, so what I've been doing is adding in a little bit. I made a gray color by some of the crimson and green and black and watered it down quite a bit, adding that gray into some of these areas. And notice how the white areas are starting to pop now. Also just going in and looking really closely at where I can see dark and where I can see light, and where I may need to add a little bit more contrast to get certain areas to pop out. You know, it's just going to take some time. If you make a mistake, you know, if you find an area that's a little bit too dark, just get your brush wet again and kind of, you know, knock it back a little bit, add some water to it over the top of it, soften it. And that sometimes is a great way to help as well. Typically, reflective areas have lots of different tones. So the more variety of tones you have, the more reflective it's going to look. Okay, well, I'm getting farther along with the bottle. You can see that I'm getting a lot more reflection and detail out of this. I'm just going to keep working away. But, you know, some techniques, lifting up the tone, adding in other translucent colors on top, looking for areas of contrast to make highlights really pop out, using really thin linear marks to start to add some of those details into this are really good techniques to kind of work in and finish this up. Okay, folks, I've gotten a bit farther on my still life here. I've added a whole lot more contrast and linear components to the glove, mixing up some black in with the Prussian blue to get some really dark areas. I've also gone back with my wet brush and pulled out some of the highlights to get this to look more like it's catching some light. I've added a whole lot of contrast in the shell, both in the bottom side and the interior, and then a lot of linear components on there as well to make it really feel textural. What I'm going to do to finish up is, I mean, I might still work a bit more onto this, but I want to get the background to look more like it has this field of depth. So I'm going to darken this in the background and a little bit in the foreground. And to do that, I've got this bigger brush that's chock full of water. And what I'm going to do is just simply bring in like an even kind of coating of water. You've got to be careful to go around these areas. I'll probably go in there a little bit more with my, my paint. But for now, I just want to get an even coating so that I can drop in some dark color pretty quickly. So I'm just getting this fairly well saturated in the background with a lot of water. And then I'm going to add in my paint. So I mixed up over here some pretty dark green, and I'm just going to start at the top and kind of brush this in. Okay, folks, so here you can see I've gotten a little farther. Check out what happened with the contrast of this area up here once I added the darker background. Now notice I just did a little bit of it, kind of did a diagonal blend. That's actually how it looks a little bit in the studio here. And actually a little bit more on the ground to sort of give a sense of surface. I'm probably going to go in and add a little more contrast to the shell eventually, but between the ground, the color, the glove, the bottle, the glass-like quality, I think I've gotten pretty far. So for you, what I'm really looking for here is, you know, first, a good representation of the form. Second, make sure that you get some nice base colors down and try to match accordingly. Third, you really got to try to bump up the contrast. You know, you're going to have a wide range of tone from light to dark, kind of, and everything in between. And then finally, scrutinize those details. Try to use the brush, experiment with different ways that you can remove areas, add layers of color, think about linear components, think about texture, dry brush techniques, wet techniques to let it dry and move around in different ways. And then finally, you know, really try to capture the light and dark. The contrast is going to be what really brings this out, makes it alive.